Will democracy survive the next couple of years?
Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Thomson Reuters, The Answer Company. Crutchfield Dermatology, a full-service treatment center and medi-spa in Eagan. Their goal is to help you look good and feel great with beautiful skin. With service built around courtesy, dignity, and respect, Mayo-trained Dr. Charles Crutchfield personally treats each patient and is acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org. Edina Eye Physicians and Surgeons, a division of Twin Cities Eye Consultants, has proudly served the Twin Cities for more than 55 years now, in 7 convenient locations. Using the most advanced technology combined with human touch, Edina Eye offers comprehensive services and dedicated specialists committed to excellence, with innovative procedures and expertise for the most advanced eye care.
Welcome to Access to Democracy. I'm Bill Raker, your host for today's episode of the program. We're excited to welcome our guest, Megan Dayton, who is a senior demographer at Minnesota's State Demographic Center. I'll get those words out right there. Welcome, Megan. We're delighted to have you with us, and we're going to ask you to share some of the data and the interesting findings that are coming out of the results of the 2020 census. But before we do that, we'd like to have our viewers know a little bit more about you and your background and what your role is there in the Department of Demographics for the state. So tell us, how do you go about preparing to become a demographer?
That's a great question. I still think about that and I try to figure out how it happened, but I've made a little bit of sense out of it, so I can share that with you. But it's very nice to meet you, Bill. It's nice to be here with you today. Thank you for thinking of our office for this talk. I came to Minnesota in 2012, so I didn't grow up here in Minnesota. I'm from Michigan. A little teeny tiny town in the Lower Peninsula in southwestern Michigan. And I moved from Michigan down to Florida, and I was doing my bachelor's degree at the Florida State University when I heard about the demography program that's there. At the time, Florida State had the only applied terminal master's degree for demography in the country. Berkeley now has another one, and Penn State does too, but at the time, Florida State was the only program. I was all set up to go to law school, and I heard about this program of applied mathematics and statistics, and I took a course and I absolutely fell in love with it, and haven't looked back since. So I came here in 2012. I did my internship in Portland, Oregon at Portland State University. And then I came here to work for our state demographer, Susan Brower, when she took over the office in 2012. Wanted to come back to the Midwest.
Well, we're glad you're here with us. And that's a great explanation for the kind of interest in education it takes to be a demographer. What are some of the fields that demography investigates and studies to make recommendations to different departments and functions within the state?
That's also a great question. Most of our colleagues that choose to become a demographer will work for the federal government, go to the Census Bureau and become statisticians for the for the Census Bureau, but there are a lot of different impacts that go into demographic analysis. Very foundationally, there's only 3 ways that a population can change. Those are births, babies being born, so the population's growing, deaths of all ages, so that's the population declining. The 2 of those together we call natural increase, so it's a way a population can change if all of the borders were closed, if no one was moving out and no one was moving in. So then the added component there is migration, and that's the real wild card. And with migration, with fertility, with mortality, there's infinite economic impacts that go into those specific characteristics of demographic change. I try to keep when I look at projections, right? So looking at recent historical trends in those 3 components of change and modeling those out into the future. I try to keep it as basic as I can, just looking at those births, deaths, and migration, because any added input that you put into those is potential error that you're adding in. And it really just gets infinite, right? So it's difficult to narrow it down to a set of assumptions that truly will be accurate, or as accurate as possible going out into the future. So I really try to focus on just births, deaths, and migration.
Well, it sounds like in demographic data, there's no opportunity and shouldn't be an opportunity for editorializing, because it's all about the facts.
That's right. And that's one of the things that I love about the field, and what I love about working at the Minnesota State Demographic Center in specific. Our office is very trained, I guess, in focusing objectively on the facts in the data that come from the Census Bureau products that we use, and reporting that out for lawmakers, for legislators, decision makers, public officials, and the private sector, for them to make decisions based on. And we have the benefit of really just reporting on the facts that are within the data.
Well, we're fortunate that you have brought with you some charts, some diagrams that will illustrate some of the data that came out of the census. And we'll get to that right after I give you this question.
Sure.
Why are demographics and the data that is in that study so important to Minnesota?
I think the answer to that question is also infinite, like the inputs that go into modeling demographic data out into the future. But it's, I think, when I try to answer that question for folks, I think all the way back to the 60s and the 70s, when demographers' offices around the country were forming. The baby boom generation was just ending the births of the baby boom generation. And demographers around the world were saying, hey, we've got to do something about this. We've got to be proactive as these kids enter school, as they leave the workforce now is what we're talking about. But all along the way, the social impacts of generations that are dissimilar in size. And it makes it very difficult to be planful for any group of people if you don't know what those people will look like going out into the future. Lawmakers, legislators are going to have a difficult time representing people in their district if they don't know who or what they are. And demographic analysis and survey responses give us the best chance of understanding those folks in a secure and private and accurate way. I think it impacts all facets of life to know the people around you, the people who you share your political power with, to make it the best place to live and work as possible.
Well, with that, let's go to some of the charts that you have, and you can explain to us the significance of this new data that has come out of the 2020 census.
Sure. Do you mind if I share my screen?
Please share your screen so our viewers can see the charts that you've prepared.
Okay, great. So I'll start with just some background that came out of the 2020 census. And I start here with a national map so we can see how Minnesota relates to change across the country. But before I do that, I take things back here to the 1950s. Leading up to the 1960 census, that was the last time that Minnesota had 9 congressional seats. After the 1960 census, Minnesota lost that 9th congressional seat and went to 8. We've had 8 ever since then, but in the 2010 census, Minnesota was allocated the very last seat in Congress by a count of about 7,000 or 8,000 people. That was an incredibly slim margin, and all of the demographers around the country were shocked that the margin could be that small. If you fast forward another 10 years to the 2020 census that we just wrapped up, we were pretty sure we were going to lose that 8th congressional seat, and we did all the organizing that we possibly could to make sure everybody was counted, counted only one time and in the right place. I think that work paid off for us because we held on to that 8th congressional seat by 86 people. That's a margin that is, that's a fraction of people that is so small that I won't go into it, but it was astonishing to see that we could hold on to political representation by a count of 86 people. So we held on to that last congressional seat one more time in 2020 here. You can see Minnesota is one of the darker green colors in the Midwest and the Northeastern states. We grew at about 7.6% over the last 10 years, which is just a touch faster than the national average at 7.4. We're now over 5.7 million people here in Minnesota. And the only other 2 states in the Midwest and the Northeast that were growing more rapidly than Minnesota are the Dakotas off to our western border, and that's due to the oil industry there. But Minnesota fared pretty well in terms of overall population growth compared to our neighbors surrounding us. Illinois, Mississippi, West Virginia, and Puerto Rico all lost population over that 10 years. That 0.1% in Illinois actually accounts for about 150,000 people. So they're actually seeing labor force contraction at this point. Their labor force is declining, and that is unique in the Midwest. But Minnesota fared pretty well. We have seen over the last 10 years, and even before that, we've seen a shift in population from Midwestern and Northeastern states to places in the South and the West. That is an actual shift in population, but we are also a highly mobile population, more mobile than we have ever been before. And we have folks who are sometimes splitting their residence between places in the Midwest and, say, the South or the Southeast, the South or the West portions of the country. And so some of this shift in political representation could be artificial, because you can't have your political representation split between 2 different places. You can't have your vote split between 2 different states or 2 different jurisdictions, right? So wherever you were on April 1st of any given census year is where you will be counted. So if we have some folks who are wintering in Florida and they're still there on the 1st of April, but they come back to Minnesota on the 2nd of April, their political representation will remain in Florida, not in Minnesota. So we have a bit of an issue of potentially some artificial shift in political representation to the South and Western states. So that's some of the shift there, but it is true movement as well. We can see that there is actual migration from the Midwestern and Northeastern states to places in the South and the West. So that's the national look at how things changed over the 2020 census. But our job as the Minnesota State Demographic Center, right, is to look below the state averages. So we look at all 87 counties here. This is the numeric population change total from 2010 to 2020. You can see that dark blue county there in the center. Obviously, that's Hennepin County that grew by about 130,000 people over the last 10 years. And that amounted to an 11.2% increase, which is obviously more rapid than the statewide average of what we had before there. And then the other blue counties, a little bit lighter counties surrounding Hennepin there, are experiencing growth as well on a numeric basis. And you can see that those blue counties kind of follow the 94 corridor up through Alexandria, and into the Fargo-Moorhead statistical area, metropolitan statistical area. You can also see pretty significant and robust growth down into Olmsted County, which is the city of Rochester, the Mayo Clinics and Hospitals. There's some pretty substantial growth in Mankato over there. And then down here in the corner, this is Nobles County. And we see sustained growth in Nobles County because of a robust agricultural industry. which keeps that county also incredibly diverse and also young, which helps maintain and sustain the growth there too. And then our job also is to look below the county level. We keep going down as far as we can, and we can get some pretty interesting city level data from the 2020 census. So this is the 20 fastest growing cities in our state over the course of the last decade. Obviously, Minneapolis and St. Paul are at the top of the list there, but just those two cities accounted for about 20% of the statewide growth, which is incredible. Rochester, with again, the Mayo Clinics and hospitals is third place on the list. Most of these other cities are somewhere within the Twin Cities metro. So we really see a large concentration of the growth happening within the Twin Cities. And actually, if you account for all of the 7 counties, that's Anoka, Carver, Dakota, Hennepin, Ramsey, Scott, and Washington, those counties absorbed about 80% of the state's overall growth. So that's really unique for us. But we do see other cities like Mankato, Rogers. There's also Otsego there on the list. So there are some greater Minnesota cities as well. And then what was really interesting coming out of this first release of census data from 2020 was the population change by the major race groups, race ethnicity groups in our state from 2010 to 2020. And I apologize, this should say 2020. So we'll just change that. Oh, here we go. So the big change here is the second line where we see actual decline for the first time in our state's history in the white non-Hispanic population. That group of folks declined by about 51,000 people, and we've never experienced that before. And so just based on that, we can say very comfortably that all of the population growth in our state over the last 10 years is fully attributable to folks who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color, which is truly incredible for a Midwestern state like Minnesota. So our second largest cultural group after the white non-Hispanic folks is the Black or African-American non-Hispanic at about 400,000. That group of people grew by about 123 or 124,000 people over the last 10 years. We're also seeing absolutely incredible growth in the multiracial category down here at the bottom. So 2 or more races and non-Hispanic. That group of folks has doubled over the last 10 years, now sitting at about 236,000 people, adding 133,000 people over the last 10 years. So just truly incredible growth. There are some changes in the way that the Census Bureau on their decennial census form allows people to self-categorize, to self-report the characteristics of their demographic alignment here. And so what we're not able to tell yet with the data that have been released from the census is if this is true growth in the multiracial category, or if it is a change in the way people have self-identified. There's been the addition of other categories. The Hispanic category just kind of came up out of nowhere in the 1990 census. And then in 2000, we got the other category for multiracial. And so when that happens, sometimes there are shifts from the way people had previously chosen to identify themselves into this new category. There was discussion about adding this time around the Middle Eastern and North African broad racial category to the 2020 census. That was ultimately not moved forward for this census, but when that is ultimately included, we will probably see a shift out of some of the categories that you see in front of you to accommodate that Middle Eastern or North African category. We know those people don't just pop up out of nowhere. So we need some more data before we can dig into this exponential growth in the multiracial category. But it is truly significant that all of the growth over the last 10 years is attributable to the BIPOC communities in Minnesota. So some really interesting initial data coming out of the 2020 census that I wanted to make sure to share with you and your viewers.
Well, thank you, Megan. Those data are very interesting. Some of them are kind of surprising as well. But as you start to dig into the data and look at the trends and some of the implications, what are the major things you're beginning to discover that are really going to continue to be impactful in the demographics of our state?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we just have the preliminary data right now, but usually when we get release of data between the decennial census, which comes from the American Community Survey, and it's benchmarked off of the decennial census, I will look at things like median household income or some economic indicators that show stability or security of the people who live in the state. Minnesota is still overwhelmingly white non-Hispanic. We still have about 70% of the population identifies as white non-Hispanic, though that population is declining. When we look at the economic standing or the economic status of Minnesotans who do not identify as white or non-Hispanic, we can see that there's a very big difference in some of those economic indicators, one of them being median household income. I think as our population increasing, or as our state increasingly depends on population and economic growth from the BIPOC community, it's truly imperative that we increase the economic standing for those folks, or the entire state will start to suffer based on those conditions. So I think that the demographic data that we've gotten so far helps to shed light on some of that. Our office continues to do that as well. But I see that really as the most impactful thing coming out of the 2020 census, is really just how important it will be to come up with some equitable legislation to improve the economic standing of all of our Minnesotans.
Well, that could prove to be a challenge. What about the shifts in the workforce? I mean, do you see the trends that the available workforce here in Minnesota is going to continue to meet the demands, the needs of that marketplace?
We see a lot of the demands in the labor force shifting even more toward nursing or personal care or food service and prep, and that's where the most of our job vacancies are occurring right now. In terms of the availability of workers, though, I think it's really just dependent on the fact that there are so many vacancies in those very specific industries, and so it's the ability of the labor market and the average offered wage for those positions to keep up with what those workers need to live. But we do see a shift in the age-specific labor force participation. And of course, this is pre-pandemic. We only have experimental data to get us through the pandemic to see what changes have happened since then. But even before the pandemic, we were seeing the baby boom generation stick around in the labor force a little bit longer than folks of that age ever had before. That allowed us to keep labor force growth happening in the state rather than the contraction that Illinois is experiencing right now, which is great. But our state really relies on migration into Minnesota for a strong workforce, and particularly international immigration into Minnesota from other countries. And so any changes that we see at the federal level directly impact Minnesota's labor force just based on that. So I think there's a lot of, like I said in the beginning when I was talking about the components of change, migration is really the wild card in trying to predict what will happen. We also have impacts like climate change. So we don't know if those coastal states will send their folks toward the interior of the country, Minnesota being one of those states, right? And so we have to wait and see what happens. But I think employers across the state are very optimistic that they'll still be able to meet the demands of their industry.
Well, we hope so. You pointed out something very important when you were talking about the population growth and the ability of Minnesota to maintain its 8 representatives, which emphasizes how important it is for citizens to be properly counted during the census period. Because it's not only the allocation of state or federal representatives in Washington, but it also affects the amount of federal dollars coming back into the state too, doesn't it?
There we go. Sorry about that. I was muted, so I couldn't respond to you. So yes, the count that Minnesota got on this 2020 census will definitely impact the amount of federal dollars that come back to the state. There's a direct impact there. We talked as we were trying to organize people to respond to the 2020 census and talk about the impact of responding to the census. There's an actual dollar amount that each person who's counted is allocated federal dollars back to Minnesota. And over the course of the decade, it's almost $30,000 for the 2010 census anyway. That number will obviously be increased for the 2020 census, but there is a huge impact on any deficit in the count in any state, but we're talking Minnesota here. And we had the highest self-response rate in the country. So I think those efforts paid off to get Minnesota some extra money to support Minnesotans across the state.
Well, it sounds like the census was as successful as we could hope for it to be here in Minnesota for us.
Yeah, I think so. We partnered with counties and cities all across the state. There was a lot of complete count committees this time around because we knew how important it was to keep that 8th congressional seat. If we had lost it and we went to 7 congressional seats, each one of those districts would have had to grow by about 100,000 people, which means that each vote in that district would be diluted by an additional 100,000 people. So becoming statistically less representative of each individual person within that district. So it was really beneficial that we kept that eighth seat. We knew how important it was, and so did all of our partners.
So the redistricting that goes on after the census, the objective there is to try to have each federal representative representing the equal number of citizens in the state?
That's correct. Yep. So you can just take that 5.7 million and divide it by 8. And it ends up being about 715,000 will be the average, or will be the target size of each one of those 8 districts.
Interesting figure. As we wrap up our program today, Megan, I want to ask you this question. You know, the census, the federal census, is done every 10 years, right?
That's correct.
So what does the demographer do in the meantime between each of the census that comes every decade?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it changes. It seems like it changes every 10 years too. If you think back to the 1990 census, everybody got a really long form. Everybody answered a number of questions. In the 2010 census, that changed. So there was only a portion of the population that got the long form, which asked for income and some more specific details about the individual. Now in 2020, nobody got that long form. So all of those more granular type data that really give us an economic picture of the state come from the data that we get in between in the American Community Survey. So we spend a lot of time analyzing those data, reporting them to the legislature and around the state. And then of course, my job focuses on population projections. So I take all of those inputs that we get from the Department of Health and the American Community Survey to take a look at what Minnesota could look like 50 years out into the future if those assumptions remain consistent. But in the meantime, we do a lot of talking to folks and groups around the state that just want to know a little bit more specifically, what does it look like around them in their part of the state for demographic change. And we also prepare estimates for school districts. So there's some in between the decennial census funding, legislative or state statute funding that comes from census counts. And it's our office that will prepare those for folks.
Well, there's a lot more to talk about in the demographer's job. Our guest has been Megan Dayton, who's a senior demographer at Minnesota State Demographic Center. Thank you, Megan. Appreciate your time and the information that you shared with us today.
Thanks so much, Bill. It was great to be here.